Right. Before that, I will put this debate on live stream, and we are now online. Good luck to both teams.
Cool. So the introductions are done at this point. I don't think there's any reason as to why we should keep this delayed for any longer, in which case I'd like to call up the first proposition speaker to open the case for their bench. Here.
Okay, once again, preferred pronouns she, her. I would also prefer to receive vocal PYs, and I will start my speech in a couple of seconds. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. At the point at which you consent to selling your data, you're way past agreeing to the collection of cookies on a random website. You're trapped in a deal framed as though it benefits you without any understanding of what that data will be collected, who it will be resold to, and how it will be used to track you. Untitled Lithuania will tell you once you sell your data, you sell your safety. What do data collection companies look like? These companies are often huge conglomerates, yet are shadowy figures in the eyes of public and mostly unknown to the people. Think Cambridge Analytica, a huge company, mostly unknown to the people before a mass scandal. They have huge databases and they buy and resell data literally daily. What world do we stand for? We stand for already existing downward trend in data collection, with more and more regulations each year that have already been passed in EU and India, for example. In this world, data collection will become obsolete. 3 arguments to substantiate these claims. First of all, why is the choice to sell data innately coercive? Second of all, what are the intrinsic harms surrounding individuals selling their privacy? Third argument, how Ops World exclusively puts the most vulnerable individuals at risk. The point that will be presented by Noise. Let's move on then to the first argument regarding whether individuals actually comprehend the deal that you're getting into. Panel, let's characterize individuals who are lured into these data selling deals. First of all, notice that to comprehend what kind of data are you selling, what kind of companies these are, and where your data can be used requires immense previous knowledge. In order to process how data breaches happen or how like algorithms work, you literally have to be an IT student. Even if opposition will say that you signed like terms and conditions, which helps you to comprehend the deal, we tell you that no one ever reads these agreements. It's just bulk of words that you scroll down and and press a check button. But second of all, while society is generally aware of the fact that their data is being tracked, they assume that choosing to be paid for it is liberating choice. You need to understand that individuals do not recognize how much they should be paid for such access to their privacy in the very first place, assuming that any amount is better than the alternative, which is none. However, they completely misunderstand that the fundamental reason why data collection corporations exist in the very first place is because websites are smaller, companies want to have access to more data than they currently do. But third of all, individuals see the selling of data as an easy way to garner profit. At the point at which you Google easy ways to profit and see this as an opportunity, you assume that selling data will lift you out of your financial struggles or will at least help you out of debt. We see this as inherently problematic, since it tricks individuals into thinking that they do not lose anything through this, since they do not have to put in efforts or time in order to actually earn this money. You're being paid a lot less than you deserve due to the preconception, misunderstanding, and general lack of IT knowledge. Why is this important? Panel will tell you that data about individual is the most vulnerable thing that you could ever think of. The way you operate on the internet, the types of videos you watch, etc., literally tells everything about you. If you Google the nearest hospital, cost of abortion, and made a call to your significant other, company automatically receives vulnerable information about you. If you watch Hassan and me every morning, company knows you're a socialist. If you have just had a baby and Google what kind of products you need, these companies will sell your data to Johnson & Johnson for the spam and will spam you with predatory ads. That is the world opposition must defend. What does this mean at the end of this argument? At the point at which the collection of data opposition provides active harm to an individual's well-being and is not a conscious choice, until the governments have an obligation to intervene and prevent individuals from making these deals in the very first place. The same parallel is used to limit an individual's bodily autonomy by governments in current legislative system, giving that citizens are unaware of the harms their actions might entail. Before moving on to to the second argument regarding the harm surrounding individuals selling their privacy, I will gladly take POI.
If individuals will not fully understand what is being used their data for, isn't it better if they have some compensation rather than none on your side of the house?
Look, first of all, this POI relies on the assumption that we also support like a collection of data. We tell you that world generally moves towards companies literally having no access to data being collected. But second of all, we tell you that individuals spend far more on things that they are being advertised to than they actually receive from these companies. Hence, individuals actually is the financial minus on their side of the house. Panel, let us take a look at the motives behind purchasing data. Notice how all of these uses are never wholly taken into account by the individual upon making the decisions to sell their data, as I've already proven how the choice to do so is coercive in nature. Two harms then come out of this. First of all, untargeted advertisement. The data sold contains valuable information for commercial entities, ranging from Google searches to screen time spending looking at a particular post or article online. This data is then sold to companies who purchase it with an aim of selling the greatest amount of their product or service. This literally looks like advertisements for expensive skincare appearing on teenage girl's Facebook after she reads an article on the causes like of acne. We find this immensely problematic, as data collection is such instance push people to purchase products that you do not necessarily even need with their hard-earned money. Direct answer to POI, how people are better off financially. Additionally, it fosters the illusion of an autonomous decision, given that comprehending the complex algorithms of targeted advertisement is impossible for the average individual. Notice how this harm is exacerbating among socially vulnerable individuals as they are, for instance, entrapped within the predatory practices of debt relief companies whose services are advertised upon searching for discounts for basic goods. The additional subpoint of this is targeted political advertisement, which we think presents crucial harms as well. We tell you that collection of data also involves the collection of IP address and their correspondence to the user's zip codes or personal information. This is intrinsically harmful as it literally permits political manipulation and voter suppressions. The policy of selling data increases the amount of data accessible to the profit-driven nature of companies. Hence, you get more information on side opposition. This information then can literally be used to advertise incorrect election dates to Black communities in the United States or promote populist rhetoric to the lower middle class of Hungary, proclaiming that Romani people are the cause of economic insufficiency. But second harm coming out of this argument is on how these corporations are unaccountable with how they store your data. As a regular individual, you're incredibly unlikely to be a target of hacking or a data breach, since you're unlikely to interest anyone. Given this, and the fact that corporations do not owe you to protect your data on opposition, and it's their property, it's not your property anymore, it becomes very, very likely that your data will be used for malicious intents. How does this look like? Corporations are extremely vulnerable to the externalities of data breaches and hacking. It is well known that data collection companies often have failing security system, which makes it easy for anyone with higher IT knowledge to breach their services. Note how even if security is tight, corporations are still actively targeted, since hackers are unaware to hack their system means to have access to millions of users' private data. This literally looks like over 500 million Facebook users' data being leaked this year due to safety loopholes, or the same amount of LinkedIn users' IP address and passwords being sold on the deep web just a couple of months ago. That is to say, even if you consent to actually selling your data, you never know where your data ends up. Thus, I'm incredibly proud to propose.
Cool. I would like to thank the speaker for this very fine speech. Can I just confirm that the rest of the panel is ready to proceed? In which case, I would like to call up Op1 to open the case for their bench. Here.
Sorry, give me a second to organize my papers. in order to survive, companies and big tech companies specifically, like Facebook and Google, have perverse incentives to gather data under both sides of the house. Side of proposition could not live in a fairy tale world where they would just simply get rid of the collection of data entirely. We question them, what exactly does this world look like? If it is the core of FB and Google's literal business model, would they rather prefer that they have paywalls that would result in the vulnerable people that they characterize not being able to access them at all? Or would they just not want these services to exist to begin with? They had to live in the status quo instead of making up a utopia, a status quo in which they're already stealing data from these citizens, and we're going to prove in our speeches that it's actually going to get far worse under their side of the house, at which point they ban this kind of financial transaction. The setup coming from opposition is threefold. Number one, note that this debate, what we prefer under our side of the house as a counterfactual is like three options for consumers. So they would so companies would offer them, like, for example, when you click onto the app, to either allow your data to be given to these companies without compensation, to not allow it, or to sell it to add compensation, insofar as companies opt into this model. But we think they're likely to shift norm to offer compensation to all individuals to opt in, because if Facebook refuses to pay me, then they'll simply go to IG, for example, or Instagram or Twitter. And instead, so companies will all offer to pay money to these individuals. I'll also characterize further my argument why that's the case. Second of all, what kind of data are we talking about? We're not just talking about, just generally taking your IP addresses, but it's also on their side, they would ban people taking surveys in exchange for money in which they state their preferences, for example, and their hair type. On their side of the house, it's things like installing certain applications or things like search histories. We also think that thirdly, we think that what this is likely to look like under our side of the house is constant access. So I subscribe, maybe I get $10 a month, or if I do one survey, I would get $1. It is not going to be the highly coercive amounts of money that they characterize, simply because this is not a viable business model for companies to do. Therefore, their argument about, all poor people will simply opt into this and not be compensated duly for their money, that is exactly a reason as to why it won't be coercive, because it isn't going to be mass amounts of money. Financial contracts are very transparent. The choice is granted to individuals as to specifically what data they want to offer up. So if I want to tell them that I was meant to this specific location, this doesn't mean blanketly that I have to tell them that I'm also a socialist and also risk being targeted by the state, for instance. That was highly unnuanced coming from their side of the house. Before I go into three arguments on side of proposition, firstly, a principled argument about why this is an illegitimate restriction of rights. Second of all, why this entails worse corporate behavior under their side of the house. And my second speaker will tell you about how we empower consumers to have more agency over their data. But before that, a little bit of refutation. Number one, what is the counterfactual? First of all, I want to note that just because the GDPR exists in the EU and India has some regulations on data, this does not mean that there's going to be no data collection on your side of the house. What the GDPR does is just makes you read long terms and conditions, which is exactly what you characterize as being the problem with the status quo. So unless proposition wants to tell us that they can come up with the political capital in every single country to simply just get rid of data collection altogether, we do not think that was a charitable context for them to defend in this instance. We also think that the idea that there's a downward trend on collection is highly privileged, and we must debate in the WSDC context, i.e. that this happens globally, not just in India and the EU. Furthermore, that this is the entire business model of literal corporations, and if Google and Facebook and other corporations, for example, SMEs that want to do targeted advertising as you characterize, want to survive, they're going to continue to do this. It just how are they going to do this on both sides of the house? I'm going to prove that it's highly unscrupulous on your side. Second of all, is there consent? I just want to note that they just have a generic argumentation that people are unable to consent into this, and they don't really give us reasons besides they get money out of it, therefore it is unconsensual. I'm going to prove in my argument that this does not actually meet the standard of banning this, but I also want to note that A, it is not a large amount of money. Secondly, we're going to give them more information. If you believe under your side that you can regulate to a significant extent, so can we. We can make these financial contracts highly transparent so people know exactly what they're getting into and be able to check boxes of specifically what they're offering up. Finally, they say that it's harmful, but they don't really prove this argument besides just saying, there's targeted advertising. We're not clear as to why this is bad, because of the fact that actually if I consented into it, this means that I probably get better services by people, because I know I get things that I actually want to see on a net. The only real harm stemming from their side of the house is hackers. But if I'm on my phone at any time, I can still be hacked very significantly. And in fact, if there's a monetary value placed on data as a commodity, it's likely to be protected very well by companies and have lots of firewalls installed, compared to your side of the house when people just have them on their computers when they're underground and they're much less protected. Into my first argument, which actually clashes with their principle, why this is an illegitimate restriction of rights. First of all, we have to illustrate what the standard of banning is actually under the status quo. It is to do with the severity of harm, because the state cannot just go and take away your autonomy from you unless there's significant harm to yourself or to other people. So I'm going to tackle this in two ways. Number one, there's no violation of the harm, i.e. harm to third parties, because it is simply my own data. But second of all, we must note that all of the harms that they talk about are actually contingent upon there being no consent. So targeted ads are not bad in and themselves, because they make money for businesses and they provide a better user experience for you. Where it becomes harmful, therefore, is where it constitutes an invasion of privacy, when you do not know when they're getting into your brains and subverting your privacy, when it makes people feel unsafe because it's theft of information that happens under the status quo, where people do not have autonomy over that information and cannot tell companies when to use it and when to not, which is what happens under our side of the house. So now that you consent into this, there is no longer such a harm. I tell them that that, for example, I have curly hair, but I do not tell them that I am a socialist. Second of all, we argue that it's unjustified, therefore, to violate the autonomy of individuals. The state cannot simply just, regardless of perceived utility, they cannot just infringe upon people because they're the best arbiters of choice in their own interest. We argue that the pursuit of individual happiness cannot be dictated by a paternalistic state. Hence why, for example, we allow people to smoke, even though that may be potentially harmful for them, or we allow them to take risky jobs, like poor people doing drug trials, for instance, because we recognize that people should be able to choose for themselves. Finally, we argue that data is actually an extension of yourself. We argue that, for example, like how we have control over property, like land, you should have autonomy over how to use it. And it's insofar as you're offering it up to companies, you should be able to get compensation in return. I'll take a point now.
Even though smoking is legal, governments limit the access of advertisement to smoking in order to protect the consumer. Why are we not allowed to protect them from targeted advertising?
Our side also has regulations. If you argue there's so much political capital for regulations, we're still able to make these highly transparent. Moreover, we're happy to do things like ban political advertising if it meets the threshold of harm. We're simply arguing that offering up your data and getting compensation for it in return is a fundamental right that people have. Second of all, whether policy entails worse corporate behavior, I want to note that Propositions World still has the very same actor incentives, the necessity of collection of big data in order for the business model to succeed. I.e., if I provide a free service to individuals, I have to make money in some way, whether this be through targeted advertising or by having algorithms that are based upon this data to begin with. Those companies will still exist under your side of the house. So things like having dubious terms and conditions that take weeks to read, that uniquely exist when there isn't a better way to get this data. What this means is that if I can access people's preferences using surveys and asking them to volunteer that information to me, what I'm going to resort to is reading their text, for instance, or being able to access data in more unscrupulous ways, which is when all of their harms manifest. Why is their alternative preferable on two fronts? First of all, there's an extra layer of consent for individuals. There are frameworks that cannot be avoided simply because it is a financial contract. So for example, I do not just need to tick a box or just say that I consent to this cookie, but instead I have to choose up which sorts of information I want to give up. I have to go through a paywall in which I type in my credit card information, and at every point in this process, I'm going to know what kind of information I'm offering up. But secondly, and most importantly, we are actually able to shift corporate incentives. What do I mean by this? Corporations are less likely to try and steal your data to begin with if there's a legal way to get this. So there's lower corporate liability if I opt for the more ethical way of getting this data. Note, for instance, that under their side of the house, Facebook got a lot of boycotts and backlash and had to pay $5 billion as a result of Cambridge Analytica. But now when we allow them a less risky way, so just paying people money for a very limited amount, their compliance departments are going to recommend this business model instead, and they're going to shift towards better ways of being able to get this data that actually compensates individuals and does not result in all of the harms, the unscrupulous means that they wanted to talk about. So instead of just offering up and give it to me for free or don't use it at all, they're going to offer, to invest significantly into this in order to ensure that they don't suffer corporate liability under their side of the house. Therefore, on two fronts, A, that this is an unjustified restriction of rights, and B, that we actually make corporate behavior better. We're incredibly proud to have.
Cool. I would like to thank the speaker for this very fine speech. Can I just confirm with the panel that we're ready to proceed? Cool. In which case, I'm going to call up Prop 2 to continue the case for their bench. Here.
Yes, thank you. Hello. He, him pronouns, verbal POIs. I'll start my speech in a few seconds. Okay. Wait, how am I to do this? Okay. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Team Malaysia today has been incredibly unengaging because they have not engaged with the fact. They try to wash us out of the debate by simply saying that, oh, all companies will still collect data on either side of the house. However, they do not engage with the financial mechanism that these people who are going to sell off their data have an extra incentive to sell off their data. Meaning that if in today's debate, we prove that just getting money for your data will get one more extra person to sell their data, then the harms are far outweighed on our side of the house than it is on theirs. Incredibly proud to propose. And my speech will have a lot of points of rebuttal, then I'll move on to the third argument. First of all, they said, in order to survive, companies such as Google and Facebook still have to collect the data, and these are their inherent business models. First of all, we disagree with this premise because companies such as Google could be perceived as a general human right and state good, as it is in, let's say, China. But secondly, we also tell you that at the point at which you are allowed, you are going to be selling your data is at this point when there's going to be more data collected because more individuals are incentivized to sell the data. But secondly, they're going to get much more sensitive information about you because there's an intrinsic difference between selling off your private property as data, and there is a different legal status than that which they can obtain from simply having cookies or whatnot, right? Because we're telling you that when this sort of contract exists, they are allowed to get more data off of you. Also, panel, notice how we're not just talking about companies such as Facebook, which like that they are portraying to be like this debate to be about, like tracking your messages or whatnot. However, we've characterized this within our first speech. These are like huge shadowy companies with the people know nothing about, such as Cambridge Analytica, which the people were like literally not aware of when they were controlling their political ideologies, right? They're telling you at the point at which people get free money for selling off their data is the point at which people are going to sell off more data, and this has been engaging. Then they attacked our point about coercion and saying that this is mischaracterized because it's not a lot of money that they're going to get. However, at the point at which they did not attack our characterization, when people are not understanding what their personal data holds, and at the point at which they can already live in a world where they freely get their data off to companies, is the point at which they see no harm in selling off their data, right? And also, at the point at which the entire news media that you consume, that being Facebook, Twitter, and the television, have a direct incentive to get that data off of you, because these are the same companies who buy and use the data, is the point at which you're not going to have a very democratic sort of system where you know what your data is going to be dealt with, right? And also, the conversion point was not attacked for the point, they did not engage with the advertising that these companies are going to have. All they said is that, oh, targeted ads are not that bad because it's going to make money for businesses. However, this is not like engage with our examples of companies being predatory to people who are in debt, like debt relief companies who are scamming these people into further debt. This is not protecting the consumer. This is not good to make the companies money. But when we asked a POI about like cigarette ads, they said, oh no, we can have regulations too. But notice how this directly agrees with the fact that targeted ads are intrinsically harmful and that they should be regulated and that they should not exist, because they agree with us on this point, right? But then they also said that, oh, people choose the data that they are actually selling, like people can choose within their contracts and whatnot. However, like this is completely untrue, because they themselves said that the people do not read terms and service agreements. And we're telling you at the point at which these companies are A, predatory, B, have a direct financial incentive to get that data off of you, they're likely to do everything in their power to manipulate you into selling your data, right? We're not talking about goodwill intention companies which will want to show you all the choices and all the options of which data you can and cannot sell. No, they will want to get everything off of you, and they're going to make the contract as convoluted as possible for you to not read that and for you to just get a few dollars out of selling your money, right? And there they said, well, no, we can have Facebook and companies like that have like transparent contracts. And at the point at which you have political capital to regulate these companies, you will also have political capital to have transparent contracts. However, notice how it is far harder for these companies to avoid a blanket umbrella ban than it is to avoid regulations. Because this has already happened with Cambridge Analytica. Because what Facebook has been doing for decades has been illegal, and regulations have not been working whatsoever. And for them to have transparent contracts is simply the ridiculous analysis, right? And we're telling you that these companies will always have a direct incentive not to have such regulations because they want more money. And we're telling you that these companies, at the point at which they have your data as their own private property, is the point at which they're also going to sell off that data to companies which are even less accountable. And this has been happening for decades at this point. Then they also said, at the point at which they like attacked hackers and saying that, oh no, when you don't have these data collection agencies, you're going to have hackers who are hacking into your own computer, which is less safe and whatnot. However, notice how we already answered this in our own argumentation, because we said that for hackers is not like there's not so much of an incentive to go into every single computer and to look for data like that, because that's A, costs a lot of resources, but B, you're not so interesting to all the hackers. However, at the point at which you have a huge data collected database is the point at which there's far larger incentive for these hackers to actually obtain such informations, and there is a much larger interest, right? So now, before I move on to my third argument, I'll gladly take a POI.
So you do agree that companies are going to be collecting data through free means under your side of the house, like through cookies, and using that for targeted advertising?
Well, yes, but like, notice, panel, how we literally answered this in my intro, right? Saying at the point at which there is a financial incentive for people to sell off their data, there's going to be more data sold off. Also, this data is going to be more sensitive at the point at which it's a private contract of your private data property. Is that the companies cannot have such big amounts of data simply gathering it freely. And also, in our framing, we said that there is a downward trend of data collection that is happening, and we are protecting and standing for this. Now, how the selling of data is used to crack down on the most vulnerable individuals. Ever since the NSA scandal caused by Edward Snowden, the world knows as to how much data malicious governments hold. At the point when the biggest data collecting agencies have constant data breaches, we tell you that government agencies may have larger incentives and resources to take that data as well. Governments often use data to track and crack down upon individuals that they see as political threats to the state. These crackdowns are not necessarily violent or even in the presence of the individual. Rather, we already see the US government using bots to make it seem that people are supporting the protest in Cuba. My own Twitter profile has been spammed by the state security of Lithuania to discredit my political activism. Notice how the data gathered can often be very personal, where you've been, who are your most beloved friends and family. This sort of data is often used during interrogations to psychologically break an individual, constantly asking personal questions that you have no idea where the government got that information. But secondly, the police will always know where you are and what you do. At the point when the government may see you as a political threat and they constantly know your location is the point at which if you want to smoke weed, where in a country where it is illegal, the police are going to pack you up at the point where you buy weed because they know where you are and because they see a political threat, not necessarily because you're doing an illegal action. They have been tracking for that illegal action. No, because you're a political threat. For these reasons, I beg you to propose.
Cool. I would like to thank the speaker for his fine speech. Can I just confirm with the panel that we're good to proceed? In which case, I'm going to call out Octo to continue the case for bench here.
Hi, can you hear me clear?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, great, nice. He's setting up my timer. I think the side of proposition has to lose this debate. From at the very start of their speeches, they also want to sell data. Every single harm they push to you, even if they tell you it's a skill and more people might opt to it because of money, intrinsically applies to them as well. The harms of targeted advertising, the harms that they've analyzed from both speeches apply to them as well. They need to tell us the large and the magnitude of the scale, or else they can't win this debate on that alone. Notice how them saying more data collected is not an intrinsic harm in and of itself. Having more data allows you to cater to individuals' needs far better. Having a targeted ad, if I just gave birth, to be able to access cheaper goods, for example, for baby oil, why was that an intrinsic harm? Side of proposition needs an actual response to this. The extent of harm which I will credit and I will respond to was the potential for political advertising. They told you it's about shady corporations like Cambridge Analytica. Notice how number one, selling your data does not mean that the government can't rein in and control the usage of that data, especially when it goes against public interest, which is literally why after Cambridge Analytica, we've banned political ban targeted political advertising. So you can have your data, but you can't use it to literally skew election cycles because it impacts every other individual's life within the country. There's a very clear delineation and regulations that you can instate on our side. But secondly, they concede that companies need this data, and they also, by their own characterization, told you these are malevolent and selfish actors, which literally feeds into our argument on how, absent of a paywall, individual corporations are going to have more shady tactics in order to coerce and implicitly steal your data from you without you knowing. Because our corporations like Facebook and Google literally need this data to survive. Absent of it, they cannot target ads towards you. They cannot function off anything, because when you search something on Google, they're unable to actually give you any sort of result because they can't draw upon existing data that's already within the cloud. That is why it's extremely pernicious and extremely uncharitable from the side of proposition to be pushing these kinds of things. Lastly, before I move on to large rebuttals and to my substantive, just one last frivolous claim. The idea that a hacker will hack you because it's in a company, but they won't hack you if it's individual. I don't think proposition knows how information and data is stored. All information is literally stored within an international cloud, which, like within China, for example, there are massive factories, there are massive transformers and collectors of data that processes it which processes all the global information. You don't target Facebook for these kinds of data. They're literally giant factories manufacturing data that could happen anyway. That is something they would then have to deal with as well on their side, given that they still want data and still accrue the harms. Two large rebuttals to them. Number one, on the idea of coercion. Notice how the preamble to this is that if I tell you why the monetary incentive is not coercive at all, they literally have no argument here within this debate. And my second will be how collecting more data is beneficial and not harmful. If I also take this down, even if they did get coercion, if I prove to you why data isn't inherently harmful, they also have nothing to stand on within this debate. And then I'll move on to my substantive argument on how having or monetizing data makes the collective conscience more aware, which then reduces the impacts of their arguments as well. On to the first rebuttal on the idea of coercion. Number one, note that everything by their own model is then coercive if you need specific knowledge, because all I have to prove is that consumers have reasonable amounts of knowledge and information to make a decision for it to then be consented to. Because as someone with no medical knowledge, I can still consent to a surgical procedure, even if I don't know everything that can happen, even if I don't know the various techniques. Because as long as I consent to the largest harm that can accrue, which is, for example, death, I can then consent to everything in between, which is why if in our side, it's extremely simple for contracts to highlight and force and mandated by the government. If you're selling these kinds of properties, they are going to tell individuals about potential targeted advertising, which is their largest harm. If an individual consents to that, they consent to all of these things happening. You don't need specific knowledge for this to be a debate, because by that virtue, I can never sign a contract because I don't have jurisprudence. I don't know how to read contracts properly. Secondly, the idea that money clouds judgment. By that logic, any choice a poor person makes is illegitimate. Everything is highly bigoted from their side, because it's a rational trade-off that they need to consider. Because if I told you, panel, that I would give you $1,000, but I would kill you the very next day, a rational individual is able to weigh the incentive and pick accordingly not to take the monetary incentive. So if I, as an individual who needs money, can make a decision that data does not impact my life, that I understand that a targeted ad could potentially hurt me, but I consent to it anyways, that isn't in and of itself an illegitimate decision if people opt into it, if there is a monetary incentive. Lastly then, the parallel to restricting bodily autonomy, which is a parallel that they drew in order to have their moral comparison. Notice how within the medical field, we allow you to sign do not resuscitate disorders, which means that if you code, people won't work on you and you'll literally die. We allow individuals to walk out of surgical procedures against medical advice, even if you will die. We restrict your bodily autonomy, but we also respect it, even if there are harms. If you can consent to it, I've proven to you 2 reasons why money does not cloud your judgment, and if you can consent to the largest harm, therefore it is legitimate, therefore the coercion does not stand on their side. Before one point.
A doctor wants to heal you and will provide you all the information you want. A company wants money from you. Which is more likely to lie?
I think individuals know that a company wants money from you. Notice that you're not going to be targeting the most poor individuals, people in debt. Because if you need money and you need products to be sold to them, why am I targeting individuals that are financially strained? Individuals that can't actually buy the products I need. But secondly, I'll just deal with this largely within my second rebuttal on how collecting data is more beneficial. Number one, we told you how it improves the quality of service you can give to individuals, being able to market these sorts of products. Notice that targeted advertising, absent of the political lens they brought brought to you has literally no intangible benefits to it, because you can still make a decision to buy that product or not. There isn't a thing that forces you to buy the targeted ad of baby oil, of diapers, for example. If you don't want it, you don't need to opt into it, but the company provides you the option and tailors certain services to your needs, which makes it far easier for you to access. Secondly, companies are able to meet larger market demand, which caters to the large market base as well. Notice how if Netflix, for example, had data that a lot of individuals wanted more representation within the media and the kinds of films that they make, they can then cater certain services to you, make more inclusive films that will then get them more profits and also at the same time cater to you. We think it's a win-win situation that Startup Proposition does not want to recognize. I'm consenting and giving my data to these individuals to do what they want, and it can also benefit me as well. Notice how harmful ads is not a targeted ad. A smoking ad is tangibly bad for an individual because it perpetuates diseases. A targeted ad is not the same. They cannot draw this parallel. Lastly, to the substantive, and notice how they have zero engagement to the two arguments brought to you from the first speaker. Number one, we told you how it increases agency for individuals on their data. Given, for example, Facebook, the minute you log in, implicitly is taking your data and you have no clue about it, and you need to go into settings, have specific knowledge to disable it. This is the kinds of practices they're going to utilize in order to take your data. If we're going to criminalize it, it's going to be data theft. If you're not going to be showing individuals these kinds of things, we're increasing the agency for individuals. Secondly, we told you how companies now cannot hide behind these kinds of practices and have to be more illegitimate if you're going to have criminality attached to it. But lastly, people are more aware about their data, because if you ask someone to give you your phone panel, you wouldn't, because you understand that your phone is valuable to you. Similarly, when you monetize data, individuals recognize that there's inherent value and it's a property that could have tangible impacts on your life. You create these social discussions, the point to which you're able to sell it, and it has some sort of intrinsic value to it, which means individuals in the future within a scale are going to be more informed about the data that they're selling. Notice that how you're not going to sell more data to individuals because you can limit the parameters to what data you want to sell. You can sell your location, but not want to sell my name. We don't think this is a gateway to more data being taken away from you. We think more individuals are going to be informed, the point to which data is monetized. We think individuals have agency, and you create correct social behavior. Proud to oppose.
Cool. I would like to thank the speaker for this fine speech. Can I just confirm that the rest of the panel is ready to proceed? Yeah. In which case, prop 3. Here.
Right. Once again, I go by she, her pronouns. I'd prefer audible POIs, and I begin my speech in a few seconds once I rearrange my notes. Judges, I'd like to encourage you to take a look at your flow sheets. Notice how the entire stance and the perception and conception of companies shifts drastically throughout what we've heard of the opposition bench so far. Said opposition's first speaker literally tells us how companies are innately predatory and concedes with us that corrupt incentives will continue to exist. However, the substantive extension that we get from side opposition's second speaker relies on the premise that companies are innately beneficial and benevolent and only aim to provide the best experience. So at the end of the day, it is unclear what kind of companies they are conceiving on their side of the house. Furthermore, notice how they literally debate this entire debate as if it were like Facebook or Google that is purchasing your data in the first place. We have told you right from Patricia's speech as to how this won't apply to social media or search engines, right? This will literally be separate shadowy entities such as Cambridge Analytica that are actually doing these deals in the first place, right? This literally looks like data brokers under their side of the house and not like these independent surveys that they seem to argue on the premise of, right? Essentially, in my speech, I'll ask and answer two key questions. Firstly, on which side of the house is actually more justified on principle? That is to say, on whether or not a ban is inherent good in this case, but secondly, on which side of the house presents more practical like beneficialities, right? Firstly, without any further ado, let me move on to the principal argumentation, right? What is the principal material that you panel received from side opposition? Side opposition's first speaker, within their first argument, essentially tells you how this is an invalid restriction on personal liberty, right? They tell us how like companies have no innate violation perpetrated by like their practices, right? Firstly, this is an empty statement. Like, what kind of violation are we talking about in the first place? If this is a violation of law, we literally have failing data protection policies, which do violate the law. But even if this isn't like a violation of law that they're talking about, and this is more like a moral standpoint, we tell you that even then, right, you have an innate violation from the moral standpoint, because you literally have debt relief companies profiting off of these struggles of vulnerable individuals, right, under their side of the house. This was a crucial characterization that was never tackled by opposition, right? But even if there is no like innate violation, we still make it illegal for them to do so, right? We're literally changing our conception of the current law. So this is literally an empty statement coming from side opposition. Furthermore, they tell you that targeted ads are essentially good because they provide you with a better experience, right? Essentially, this type of argumentation relies on the premise that individuals won't be able to find what they actually currently tangibly need via their own searches, right? Such as typing in like diapers in a search engine, right? The point at which you choose to buy from a targeted ad, right, is the point at which you didn't look that product up in the first place, right? That is the point at which you didn't really need it to the extent, right? And were actually coerced into buying it. Because of this inherent like flawed perception and logical fallacy, this argumentation doesn't stand either. Right? They tell you that essentially these individuals can tell companies what they can track and what they don't have access to, right? But we tell you that the frame of the debate wasn't like Facebook or Instagram offering you personal surveys for cookies, right? It's literally Cambridge Analytica that buys this information. This literally looks like data brokers that employ psychological manipulation that doesn't exist on the screen that we have under our side of the house, right? The comparative of side opposition's first speaker is as to how like we have like long text under our side of the house that nobody reads, right? Under their side of the house, you have like psychological manipulation that directly tells you that these texts are like incredibly irrelevant, thus coercing you into incredibly predatory deals. But furthermore, they have this argumentation regarding like bodily autonomy because like data is the extension of self, right? Notice how these are just like empty, pretty statements in the first place, right? That literally give you no material and no mechanistic analysis, right? But even then, we tell you that you are more aware of yourself in the first place. You're not aware of what your data is like going to and what it actually is in the first place, right? This is literally the reason why The Social Dilemma on Netflix was such a big cultural reset, because people were so unaware of what is being done with their data. Ultimately, you get no like principal material that stands by the end of the debate from side opposition. On side proposition, we have told you as to how you have a necessary prerequisite of knowledge in order to make a like conscious choice, right? Side opposition's second speaker essentially tells you that everything is coercive, but Noyes already points out in his POI how, for instance, their analogy to doctors are literally obliged by law and mandated to explain what the worst like consequences of a surgery can be. They have direct incentive to explain everything to you, so you're less nervous, right? The comparative that we gave you is like restrictions on bodily autonomy, such as illicit substances, right? Heroin dealers, much like these companies, right, have no incentive to actually inform you of the consequences of your data being sold off. So essentially, this comparative on the prerequisite of knowledge falls under our side of the house. Essentially, they further tell you that, hey, there's this assumption that like, given that these individuals are paid, thus they have like this innate good and are more liberated, but it already tackles in her response to her POI as to how like individuals are forced into more like detriment and do not actually get the liberation under their side of the house, right? Furthermore, we essentially tell you as to how like these individuals are tricked into thinking that this is a one-sidedly beneficial deal. This was further asserted by side opposition's first and second speakers, but however, they failed to tackle the material from our side of the house, literally looking like debt relief, preying on those most vulnerable, right? We tell you that data about yourself is extremely vulnerable, right? The precedent of this is literally bodily autonomy restrictions, such as that of illicit substances, right? When individuals cannot consciously evaluate the harm, right? And when the harm is great to a big extent, that is the point at which they ban this. And side opposition actually concedes with this when they tell you that cigarette advertisements ought to be regulated, right? That is the point they concede with us, that some harm to a certain extent exists. But, however, they never tackle the extent of harm presented to you by Patricia and by Noyes. Ultimately, we win on principle. Before moving on to the second clash point, then regarding the practical clash points of today's debate, I'll gladly take a POI.
Cambridge Analytica happened with no exchange of money. If companies are selfish on both sides of the house, are they more likely to steal your data unscrupulously when there is an ethical alternative or where there is none?
we have literally already explained as to how we have like a downward trend in data collection, right? This is exactly what we support. We want to limit their access to these types of like things, and data selling actually legitimizes data collection in the first place. That is exactly what we won't support under our side of the house. That is exactly why we ban it. Moving on to the practical implications, either side of the house presents them. What did side opposition tell? Side opposition gave you a very vague argument as to how this like incentivizes worse corporate behavior, right? Essentially, they explained to you how they're like a lot of companies currently run on free service provided, so they need to have targeted advertisement in order to survive. The crucial thing to note under this subpoint panel is they never explain to you why like Facebook and Google are so important to the extent where you have to literally sacrifice the lives of vulnerable individuals that are then entrapped within like debt relief companies under our side of the house, right? We tell you that given that like Zuckerberg massively like underpays his workers and literally like shelters far-right groups, like we're happy to not support this. There's literally like no comparative impact on why not having this is such a like a net harm for humanity, right? But furthermore, they tell you that essentially that like these companies can't access data, so they read your messages, but Noise already tells you that this is literally what data collection is when it's so predatory and conducted by these brokers. Furthermore, they tell you that somehow corporations are less likely to steal data, but the thing to note here is that the impacts remain symmetrical, right? Because under their side of the house, they just obtained it legally, causing those same harms. However, under our side of the house, we have already told you as to how it is far harder for them to actually avoid this blanket ban in the first place. That is something that regulations cannot achieve because it's far more obvious when it's done under a blanket ban, right? Essentially, what we told you on side proposition in terms of practical implications was literally incredibly sophisticated analysis from Patricia's speech regarding predatory advertisement tactics as to how it literally pushes individuals into a loop of like financial insecurity because they think and presume that they need these products that they didn't actually search up in the first place. Furthermore, we have explained the net harms of political advertisement. This literally looks like Black communities being advertised the wrong election dates across the US, right? This is exclusive to the data collection, to the data selling, because like you get more of it, right? Under their side of the house, right? Essentially, we have told you as to how hackers, like given the unsafety that data collection often entails, have more incentive to then steal from these companies because all data of multiple individuals is centralized. Thus, they can find a single decryption key, right? And simply unlock all of the passwords as happened with like CityB, right? But essentially, crucially, the political martyrdom point that was presented in Noy's third argument was never responded to. So given the fact that we have better practical implications under our side of the house, and given the fact that side opposition's principal material was fickle, we take today's debate.
Cool. I would like to thank the speaker for this very fine speech, confirming the panel is ready to proceed. In which case, I'm calling up to start off the block of three. Here.
Just a second while I set up my timer. All right, starting in 3, 2, 1. Proposition refuses to debate the debate today. This motion was about one policy: banning users from selling their data. They instead decided to defend random burdens like 1, all data is bad, 2, all advertisements are bad, instead of the burden that proves the harms of this monetary exchange that was in the motion. I want to then note that every single word coming from their side of the house is based on one premise: that they don't want any data collection to take place on their side of the house. At no point did they decide to tell us how feasible this was to begin with. We told them to debate in a realistic context where we prove that they will have the same collection, but it's actually worse when they incentivize further bad actions. Their principal argumentation falls. Their ability to regulate and have practical argumentation falls at the point where they couldn't prove the premise of their policy. But note the case shift, because they first say that they will have no collection at all, and then say that no, the extra person that's selling their data is bad. Panel, it's not one extra person selling, it's one extra person being paid for their data rather than simply clicking consent without compensation. This was the nuanced framing that we brought from the start. But I have 3 questions to ask in my speech today. 1, how does does this affect future actions of companies? 2, how principally legitimate was this ban? And lastly, on some weighing on benefits, right? But first, how does this affect future actions of companies? The crucial piece, the entire premise of their benefits was that they don't have data collection whatsoever on their side of the house, and therefore they think that they can avoid all the principal violations. But I want to deal with how unrealistic this characterization was. Number one, then, on the incentives of these companies. At the point of this ban, we asked them, why will corporations go to any length to have this data to begin with? There are a few reasons why they will go to any length to obtain this data. One, their ability to make and sell products is contingent on information about buyers, about preferences, about market attitudes, right? They need these locations. They need access to what people want to see in their products. This is directly linked to the profit incentives of these companies, which is why they will do anything to continue obtaining this data. 2, this is especially true about the types of companies they brought up to begin with, like big tech. Panel, did you know that the only thing Google makes profit off of, the only thing, is collecting and selling data of users on their platforms? If this was not the case, all these giant platforms would be run to the ground. But what does this mean for their MEC panel? It means that if governments want to enact this ban as well as other limits, it won't take place to begin with because of backlash. They say companies want to deregulate on both sides. But the nuance we brought to you was that more will opt in because it was cheaper for them to comply with the legal framework on our side of the house. On their side, the only option remaining is the malicious actions like lobbying, and they activate this intent to deregulate on their side. The fact that big tech is already in the pockets of politicians, if they wanted to propose this extent of legislation, they needed to defend its feasibility or accept that it was simply worse on their side. But let's say their best case, they are even able to pass this regulation. But this is exactly the context where all our harms manifest. And note the nuance of our second argument that we brought to you, where we said that companies with superior technology will just find other ways to skirt the law and obtain this data. This is when the extra wall of having a ban on payment is especially harmful, because in their minds of corporations, there is no avenue to legally obtain data, and in their minds, it's justified. This will become an entire black market on their side of the house. But second, then, on legal frameworks, right? First, note that we agree that status quo is moving towards consumer data protection because of rising awareness, for example, Google selling their data. But why do they explicitly reverse this progress on their side of the house? One, they have now severely limited the amount of data that these companies can collect. This means even if they are forced to continue working within the law, you have more websites where the terms and conditions are in minuscule text, overwhelming, or cannot be understood by the average consumers. So yes, terms and conditions exist on both sides, but our model of a transparent financial transaction means that people are not only incentivized to read them, more people opting in makes the government tell these companies that no, you have to make these terms and conditions clear. On their side of the house, they need to obtain data by whichever means possible, and will intentionally make this more and more difficult to understand. But it encourages more companies to operate outside of the framework. This is because of the weighing I just gave you about desperation. In our world, they realize that choosing a legal avenue is a less risky model. On their side, they're incentivized to take this risk because they cannot obtain this kind of nuanced data elsewhere. But even if there are some companies on both sides always operating outside of legal scale frameworks, we still take this point on scale when we told you about the normalizing effect and how a majority of companies wanting to opt into this exchange will be good, as well as having all the spillover benefits of these regulatory frameworks being established crucially because of the monetization of this exchange. This is why we break the deadlock panel, because we exclusively prevent companies from skirting these laws. On their side, laws are as loose as possible because of the relationship is different, because they are incentivized to do things like lobbying. But I want to move into my second clash about how principally legitimate this ban is. The first point on lack of information. Note they actually never gave us an impact throughout the debate about this lack of information that takes place, because both sides agree that this data is not the best kind. But the audacity to run that we are the ones which have a coercive alternative when they are the ones that enable this. Because if we've proven that data collection happens on both sides, this debate becomes about which relationship is more principally legitimate. On their side, most of the data is either obtained via really complex consent agreements or a lack of information. The fact that on default, Facebook is tracking you. The comparative to this alone is that we enable you as an individual to make money off of this structure where the data is not necessarily always good. They frame this as being problematic. Panel, I don't see anything that's wrong in making money over selling the data that fundamentally belongs to me as a person, and I am giving away my autonomy. They assert that these people are unable to determine what's good for them. But Evan told you why this is unlikely to be a case, because one, in a world where more of these transactions exist and more people take part, governments are forced to set standards about clarity of data and the levels of payment that you receive. But two, people are rational, and wider awareness about this trend means they know about things like perverse incentives. But even if if people know nothing, they are satisfied with the money. And so in their mind, this is a legitimate transaction. The assumption is that if you give them full information, they wouldn't opt in. But because of the returns, we say even if they had full information, they would still be opting into this to begin with. But what's the comparative? On their side, they actually enable overriding of autonomy if more countries are urged to do it illegally and people have no idea what they're getting into, what it is used for. Panel, then ask yourself which side becomes more coercive. The impact of this is that I've taken down their only contention to consent because people actually, one, do have information, and their best case, if they don't have information, the worst case weighing is that on their side, they're actively denied all information when companies lobby to do things like deregulate or skirt the law. But before I move on to the uses of these informations, sure.
Is political manipulation of people and not giving data to Black individuals where elections are going to be held good?
I'm going to answer this in my next class, right, as to what this data is being used for in the future. Because the only harm they really brought to us today was that targeted ads are bad and not necessarily data in themselves. One, note they never actually told us how targeted or political ads are different from the subconscious coding that takes place every single second that I am an individual in society. We have news organizations feeding you bias and false information. You have every single advertisement appealing to your unconscious desires, all government statements giving imperfect information. Institutions are coerced. This was too high a burden for them to say that they exclusively defeat simply by removing payment. They cannot avoid this. They say that we have the same harms, right? But just with consent added onto this. One, we told you that actually companies do some beneficial things too. They're actually improving their products for their consumer base to access nicer products, and lots of people actually like having recommendations of like the products that they want on their pages. But what breaks this deadlock is that they enable all these harms to take place without consent. When companies skirt the law and you actually don't know where your data is going, right? And then they say that the last nuance is that governments actually have this, but you don't need companies to be involved in order for governments to steal your information. The software used by Indian government to hack into activist account was Israeli state software. It wasn't companies. We also don't think that they solve this in any means or form. Ladies and gentlemen, when you have a case that is based on a single premise of like not being able to have regulation, and your entire case is based on not achieving feasibility, we say you simply cannot win this debate on principle or practical terms.
Cool. I would like to thank the speaker for this fine speech. I will assume that the panel is ready. We've done pretty well till now. In which case, we're going to move on to the reply speeches, starting off with op reply. Here.
At the end of this debate, I'm left very confused as to what the side of proposition really stands for, because it's a case shift from first to second to third. At first they say that they want a downward trend in data collection. Then their arguments supposedly imply that they're against all data collection and all advertising at all. But then in a response to POI, they essentially conceded in their second speech that they do want this data to still exist. It's just a marginal scale. So it's very confusing, and judges, I can understand if you're very confused by this debate. 3 questions in this reply. Number 1, is this coercive? Second of all, is data collection good or bad in and of itself? And thirdly, and very importantly, what does data collection look like on both sides of the house? Because side of proposition never wanted to deal with a counterfactual. When they talked about Cambridge Analytica, that happened regardless of a monetary transaction. The incentives will exist under both sides of the house. This is about how we shift them. Will they deregulate more under their side of the house, or will they change to opt into these more ethical practices on our side? First of all, is there coercion? I would first note that there's no response to the agency at all from their side of the house. When we tell you that it's intrinsic to your personhood, this is essentially an extension of your identity, and you should have the right to own your property and have autonomy over it and be able to sell it for compensation if you want. I'm going to talk about 2 things then under this. Number 1, they tell you that a monetary incentive is coercive. We're not sure as to why. I think we sufficiently rebut this in second when we tell you it's actually a rational trade-off, because they don't give you any reasons as to why this is bad. If people can go to work, if people can work in ostensibly dangerous conditions, that is something that's fine. But the second thing they say that that people do not understand the harmful implications of data. Again, we're not really sure as to why this is the case, besides them saying they will just lie to you. This is empirically untrue, because we've told you that we can regulate. If their model is literally things like the GDPR and the EU and India having more regulations, that is something that we can under our side of the house as well. Moreover, we proved to you that actually it'll be more preferential for them to not lie to you under our side of the house, given that they can then avoid legal liability if there are better ways to be able to make money. Furthermore, it was simply untrue that you could not be, that this was the standard for coercion, because people just needed to know what was the worst possible outcome of this policy. So if I'm a socialist and I know that this could potentially fall into the wrong hands of the government, this is not information I'm likely to offer up. Similarly, I can sell a house and I know that someone may be able to trash it, but I don't need to know specifically how they're going to use that down the line. We told you that it's simply about them being able to know that they're going to use for targeted advertising, and that was consent in and of itself. If I tell my eye color to these individuals and to these companies, we're not sure what the large harm is going to be and why people could not meaningfully consent into that. I think that they simply assumed all individuals simply did not have autonomy. Second of all, is this data collection good or bad in and of itself? Note that their argument in principle was that getting data is bad because of targeted ads, but this is a principled inconsistency. If they want to argue that this still exists and tech giants still exist, what is this marginal scale in which they're defending that data collection gets better under their side of the house? First of all, they simply asserted that there is a downward trend, even though this is empirically untrue. Data collection is a growing industry that is getting bigger and bigger day by day. We have no analysis to suggest why this is true. Moreover, we think that the only thing standing is that ads are bad, because given that we've proven to you that because our argument was nuanced, that is harmful insofar as you don't consent, but we clearly told you that now you know what is being taken away. You have information, and harms uniquely materialize on proposition when people do not consent and you have unscrupulous means of collecting it. Therefore, the only thing left standing was that ads are bad. Well, political advertising, okay, ban it. And it was nonsensical for the third argument to take place in oppressive states because they would oppress you with this information to begin with. We rebutted this in second speaker, no response. Do not let them get away with telling you that we had no response. Then if ads were all so predatory, if we've given no analysis as to why this is true, then why can't I walk on the street and walk past a billboard? There were benefits that they never wanted to deal with, like Netflix having more inclusive programming, given that they were able to access information, like us having services like Facebook and Instagram that allow us to connect with the people we love uniquely because of these. And if they wanted to stand by their principled argumentation, they would get rid of all these services altogether. Finally, what does data collection look like? Because this killed this case, it did not matter if they got on a scale less data because it collected in worse ways, right? So on their side, you have companies that lobby to deregulate. And instead of accessing your preferences through surveys, for instance, or asking you to give it up in exchange for money, they would look at your text. If they really cared about people, then they would go with our side because it became better in two main ways. One, because the individuals consented more explicitly because you could not just click on a cookie. Financial contracts meant that this is better. But second of all, you organically shifted incentives because it's far better to pay people cheap amounts rather than risking legal liability as they would have you believe under their side of the house. If they wanted to argue Cambridge Analytica, that is the status quo, that is the proposition side. We make it better only on opposition.
Cool. I would like to thank the speaker for this fine speech. Now we're moving on to the prop reply, assuming the panel is ready, to close the case for their bench and indeed the debate as a whole. Here.
Yeah, thank you. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. It is not enough for Team Malaysia to just say that our best case is impossible and then win the debate on that. They said we must prove how data collection would not happen downright. But however, we did not ever claim this. We said that there is a downward trend that we do support and that more data means more harm. More sensitive data means more harm. 3 points of strategy before I move on to my reply. Firstly, notice how our third argument was only rebutted in the 8-minute, 15-second mark of their third speech. This argument still stands in this debate. Secondly, how within their third argument, they brought a lot of new analysis about how, monetary incentive for these companies will mean that they will self-regulate somehow because they will be fearing of financial liability. Notice how we do not have enough time to even answer this absurd argument. However, this is like not even new analysis, it's no analysis because it's dumb. Now then, they also said that there's going to be like targeted ads and political advertisements are not so bad and because they are already omnipresent. Notice how this also came in their third speech, and this doesn't make sense because is this just a whataboutism saying that, if we need to ban political ads, we need to ban them everywhere and then just try to wash us out of this debate. But notice how the entire debate strategy of Team Malaysia is to wash the debate, is to not engage, is to not argue, but to simply say that all the negatives are equal. However, at this point, they only have 1 point of positive material. And that point of positive material is that people are going to get money from this. However, we answer this. panel. At the point at which companies give you money to get your data, it's still more profitable for those companies. Otherwise, they would not do this. People do not get money from this. People get targeted subliminal advertisements from this that force them to buy a lot of products. 2 points I'll answer. How much data is gathered? Money, they said, money does not cloud your mind, and this is a rational choice that the consumer can make. Notice how this does not make sense with their own analysis, because they themselves agreed with us within their first speech that people are already giving their data away for free without actually understanding what they're doing. They already agreed with us. They just click the box on the terms of service agreements. They simply said that, oh, we're going to have more transparent contracts and that these companies will have more of an incentive to do good because they're just like doctors. They want to heal you. However, like, these companies are not like doctors. These companies are those who want to scam people out of debt relief and put them into further poverty because it is profitable for them. However, notice how they did not even engage with the bulk of Patricia's analysis about the characterization of these individuals, about how these individuals must have like IT knowledge to even comprehend what is happening with their data, to even comprehend where their data is going. And that getting this free money somehow is not an extra incentive for these individuals to sell more data than when they already give this data away for free, right? However, they also never engage with the point how you are selling more sensitive data about yourself. Because at the point at which this is a contract of you selling off your private data, is much more data can be gathered than simply going on the website and accepting 2 cookies. They also never challenged our definition of these corporations being shadowy figures who people know nothing about and how they do not have any sort of accountability. They even talk about these big corporations themselves. At the point at which you sell off your data to Big Corp International and do not know where is it going and how you're going to be politically and psychologically manipulated with that data, is the point at which getting money for this is simply not worth it, guys. Yes.
Cool. I would like to thank the speaker for this very fine speech, and indeed everyone for what was a very, very good debate. The way this is going to work now is that the judges are going to go into a breakout room, unclear on which one that breakout room will be. And then we'll come back as soon as possible with the best possible OA for you. Again, thank you.